Welcome to the deep dive. We are shifting gears today.
We really are.
If you have been following our recent discussions, you know we have spent quite a bit of time exploring the theoretical architecture of political systems. We have looked at blueprints for ideal democracies, methodically built from the ground up in a pristine academic vacuum.
Right, the perfect scenarios.
Exactly. But today, that theoretical whiteboard is being pushed aside. We are examining a system currently under immense real-world stress. And we are going to analyze the blueprints for a mechanism designed specifically to prevent its immediate collapse.
That is precisely the shift we are making. Our focus today is an analysis of the sixth lecture in a series delivered by Professor Wojciech.
Which is a notable departure for him.
It is. If you are familiar with the professor's previous work, his focus has largely been on the methodical, long-term design of an ideal constitutional system.
Yeah.
But today's source material takes a sharp, urgent detour. We are leaving the quiet realm of ideal theory and entering the chaotic, high-stakes territory of immediate crisis management. We are basically talking about triage.
And just a quick but essential heads up for you listening before we get into the mechanics of this. The source material we are examining details a very real, highly charged political scenario currently unfolding in Serbia.
That's very current.
And as we navigate this text, we are explicitly taking no political sides. We are not making political endorsements, nor are we validating the specific claims of any political party mentioned in the lecture.
Our mission here is strictly analytical.
Right. We are impartially reporting on Professor Ink's framework and the subsequent debate that occurred in the room. We are here to look under the hood at the engineering of his proposed solutions and to understand the deep societal tensions those solutions are attempting to address.
It serves as a fascinating case study in democratic triage. We are going to look at this with a highly analytical lens. We are aiming for a thoughtful examination of the quiet gravity involved when engineers and citizens attempt to redesign a failing democratic mechanism in real time.
While the engine is still running, essentially.
Exactly, while the engine is actively sputtering.
Let us start with that first major shift we see in the source material, the pivot to pragmatism. The context provided at the start of the professor's lecture is one of an impending, acute political crisis.
The clock is ticking.
It is. Elections are looming on the horizon. Depending on how the political winds shift, they could happen potentially as early as June, or perhaps they get pushed to the end of the year.
But the exact date on the calendar is almost secondary to the atmosphere that deadline creates.
I mean, it is an atmosphere of intense pressure and potential systemic failure.
The professor opens by outlining a very specific, very dangerous threat matrix. He assesses the current climate and concludes that if these upcoming elections proceed under the existing rules that a large portion of the electorate views as fundamentally compromised.
And that is a crucial point, the perception of the rules.
Right. If they proceed under those rules, the opposition, along with significant portions of the general public, including highly organized student movements, is highly likely to boycott the process entirely.
And we need to pause here to really understand what that actually means, because for you, sitting at home, a political boycott might just sound like a statement of protest, a sit-in.
It is much more severe than that.
It is. A mass boycott of a national election threatens deep institutional failure. If a massive segment of the voting population simply refuses to participate because they believe the game is entirely rigged, the government that emerges from that election lacks fundamental legitimacy.
It is governing a fractured state.
And the professor is quite explicit in his warning here. This path of total institutional breakdown frequently leads to street violence and a severe fracturing of the society itself.
Which brings us to the core concept of this specific lecture. Because the threat of collapse is so imminent, the professor is not proposing a perfect democratic system today.
He is not trying to build utopia.
No. He is proposing what he terms an emergency patch. Think of it as a functional bandage. It is not designed to heal the underlying disease permanently.
It is designed to stop the bleeding.
Precisely. To keep the society from fracturing in the immediate term.
The way he frames this patch is deeply rooted in his background as an engineer. He is looking for a mathematical compromise. He uses a term that I found incredibly helpful. He is searching for the minimum acceptable intersection.
The minimum acceptable intersection. It is a brilliant way to visualize political compromise.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Imagine a Venn diagram for a moment. One circle represents the absolute minimum demands that the opposition requires in order to participate in the election.
the bare minimum they will accept.
Right, and the other circle represents the maximum concessions the ruling party is willing to make without relinquishing their structural advantages entirely.
And usually, those circles overlap.
In a healthy democracy, yes, those circles overlap significantly. You find a middle ground. But in a crisis, they barely touch.
They're pulling apart.
Exactly. The professor is trying to use engineering principles to define and codify that tiny overlapping sliver in the middle.
But wait, if I can play devil's advocate for a moment here, isn't a patch like this just a compromise that ultimately leaves absolutely everyone unhappy?
In a way, yes.
I mean, the opposition doesn't get the fair system they want, and the ruling party has to give up power they don't want to lose. How does a system survive if it is just a bandage over a wound that everyone knows is still there?
That is the exact tension of pragmatism. You are entirely correct that no one gets exactly what they want. But think about it in terms of structural engineering. If you are standing in a building and you notice a massive crack in the primary load-bearing pillar, you do not immediately start drafting a 10-year plan to redesign the entire skyscraper with better materials.
Because the building is falling down today.
Right. You bring in steel braces and you weld an emergency patch onto that pillar today. The patch is ugly. It is not the architect's original vision, but it keeps the roof from collapsing on the people inside.
That makes sense.
The professor's argument is that Serbia's democratic pillar is cracking, and the emergency patch is the steel brace needed to ensure the upcoming elections happen at all.
Preventing the crisis from spilling permanently into the streets.
Exactly.
So to understand how this steel brace is supposed to work, we first need to understand the cracks in the pillar. We have to examine the systemic flaws this patch is designed to bypass.
Which leads us directly into the professor's critique of the current ballot system.
Specifically, the proportional electoral system they're using. And I think we need to break this down clearly because terms like proportional electoral system can sound a bit opaque if you don't study political science.
It is essential to unpack this. The source material is highly critical of how this specific proportional system is functioning in reality.
What is the main issue he identifies?
The fundamental flaw, as outlined in the lecture, is that it provides the illusion of choice to the voter while actively operating as a closed loop that blocks new, independent voices from ever entering the political arena.
Let's try to visualize this for you, the listener. Imagine you and 99 other people are ordering food for a massive party.
A classic analogy.
In a standard majoritarian system, like a simple first-past-the-post vote, if 51 people vote to order pepperoni pizza, all 100 people are eating pepperoni pizza. The winner takes the whole order.
Right.
Now, in a proportional system, the idea is that the representation should match the vote. So if 10 people vote for anchovies, 10% of the pizza ordered should have anchovies.
It ensures minority voices get a slice of the pie.
In theory, it sounds incredibly fair. But, as Professor Schenk points out, in this specific implementation of the system, the people running the pizzeria are actively rigging the menu.
That is an excellent way to frame it. The proportional system in this context has been engineered to serve the established political machines.
How does that actually happen mechanically?
Let us look at the specific mechanics of how this closed loop operates, starting with what the professor identifies as the list carrier mechanic.
The list carry.
Yes. When citizens walk into a polling station under these current rules, they are not looking at a ballot and selecting an individual representative from their local community to go to the Capitol and speak for them.
Right. They are presented with a massive prepackaged list of 250 candidates.
But these candidates are essentially anonymous to the average voter. They are hidden.
They're just names on a very long piece of paper.
If they are even listed at all, the entire list is branded and marketed behind a single list carrier. And the lecture notes that this list carrier is frequently a highly prominent dominant figure, such as the President of the Republic.
So the voters are casting their ballot based on the recognizable face on the poster?
Exactly. It operates almost like a bait and switch. To use another analogy, it is like buying a very expensive ticket to see a global superstar, let's say a Beyoncé concert.
Okay, I am following.
Her name is in massive letters on the marquee. You buy the ticket based on her brand. But when you walk into the arena and the lights go down, it's actually a cover band of 250 complete strangers playing the instruments.
And Beyoncé isn't even in the building.
She isn't even in the building.
And the crucial detail the professor highlights is that this figurehead, the list carrier, does not even have to serve in the parliament.
They frequently do not.
They lend their name, their aura, and their brand to the top of the ballot to pull in the votes. But the actual lawmakers who eventually enter the National Assembly and draft the laws remain faceless.
They are entirely unaccountable to the public.
If you, the voter, have an issue with a new tax law or an environmental regulation, you have no idea who on that list of 250 people is actually responsible for drafting it.
It completely severs the fundamental link of accountability between the representative and the represented. You aren't voting for a detailed legislative platform.
And you certainly aren't voting for a specific local advocate who understands the needs of your neighborhood.
You are voting for a singular, centralized personality. The result is an assembly where the majority simply follows the dictates of the party headquarters and the list carrier, rendering the actual legislative process largely performative.
Because the members of parliament are not independent thinkers in this setup.
No, they are loyalists who owe their seat entirely to the fact that they were placed on the list by the party boss.
But the anonymity of the politicians is really only one part of the problem here. The professor then details a secondary, incredibly steep logistical barrier designed to keep newcomers out of the race entirely.
This is where the structural engineering really comes into focus.
Because if you are listening to this and you think, well, if the current lists are terrible, why don't regular citizens just start a new one?
It seems like the obvious democratic solution.
It does, but the lecture explains exactly why you can't. To register a new political party, a movement, or even a citizens group under the current rules, the organizers must gather 10,000 signatures.
Now, on the surface, 10,000 signatures for a national election might not sound like an insurmountable number for a country of millions.
It sounds difficult, but perhaps manageable for a dedicated group.
But you have to look closely at the constraints the state places on those signatures.
Right, because these aren't just signatures on a clipboard that you gather outside a grocery store on a Saturday afternoon.
Precisely. They must be legally notarized signatures.
Which changes everything.
It does. Every single person who wishes to support the creation of this new electoral list must physically present themselves before a state-appointed public notary.
They have to show their identification.
And sign the document right there in front of them. And the notary charges a fee for this service.
So there is an immediate financial cost per signature.
Yes. But more importantly, it creates a massive intentional administrative bottleneck. There are only so many notaries in the country, and their offices are only open during certain hours.
And the clock is ticking. The lecture emphasizes that this entire logistical mountain must be climbed within a highly restrictive 30-day window after the elections are officially announced.
It is what we would call a systemic moat.
A moat.
Think of a medieval castle. The moat isn't there to keep everyone out. It is there to ensure that only the people the king invites can cross the drawbridge.
That makes perfect sense.
This 10,000 notarized signature rule perfectly protects large, wealthy, entrenched political party machines. These established parties already have millions of dinars in their war chests.
They have the infrastructure?
They have the pre-existing infrastructure, the lawyers, and the capital to deploy notaries across the country the minute the election is announced. They can bus their loyalists to the notary offices and pay the fees without blinking.
But imagine you are one of the independent academic experts or student coalition leaders mentioned in the lecture.
You don't stand a chance.
You have a brilliant plan for reforming the education sector or fixing the municipal water supply. You don't have $1 million war chest. You don't have a fleet of buses.
No.
For a grassroots movement, attempting to gather 10,000 notarized signatures in a single month is an exhausting, nearly impossible financial and logistical hurdle.
You spend all your energy and money just trying to get on the ballot,
leaving you with absolutely nothing left to actually campaign on your ideas once you finally get there.
It guarantees that the only entities capable of participating in the democratic process are the ones already inside the system. It is a perfect closed loop.
And this is exactly where Professor Eng's engineering mindset really shines through in the source material. His proposed emergency patch targets this precise bottleneck with what we might call a radical pragmatic hack.
I love how the source material frames this, because the professor doesn't suggest reforming the notary system or giving grassroots movements more money.
He looks at the barrier to entry and proposes lowering it by completely shifting the burden of entry. He introduces the 50-signature rule.
Instead of demanding 10,000 signatures for a massive anonymous party list, the professor proposes moving the requirement away from the collective party and tying it directly to the individual candidate.
Okay.
Under this proposed patch, An individual who wishes to run for a seat in the parliament does not need a massive party apparatus behind them. They simply need to gather 50 signatures of support.
Okay, let me pause you there and play the skeptic again, because if I am listening to this, I am immediately thinking 50 signatures.
It sounds low.
That is incredibly low. If I only need 50 signatures, couldn't I just get my extended family and my rugby team to sign a piece of paper, and suddenly I am running for national office?
That is the natural concern.
Doesn't dropping the requirement from 10,000 to 50 instantly turn the election into a chaotic circus with thousands of random people on the ballot?
That is exactly why the mechanics of the rule are so important. The professor is not suggesting this to create chaos. He is using 50 as a specific metric of basic social credibility.
Social credibility?
Yes, he notes in the lecture that 50 signatures is a highly achievable metric for any serious individual, but it still requires effort.
You can't just do it entirely alone in your house.
Right. It implies gathering support from your family, yes, but also your professional colleagues, your neighbors, and people in your community who actually know your character.
So it is a filter.
His underlying philosophy here is simple. If you cannot convince 50 people in your immediate real-world circle that you are fit for public office, you absolutely should not be running. It is a filter for basic seriousness.
And there is a geographical anchor to this rule, too, isn't there? You can't just go to a crowded train station in the capital and get 50 random commuters to sign.
Correct. To ensure genuine local representation and to prevent carpetbagging, the rule stipulates that half of those signatures, 25 of them, must come from the candidate's actual local municipality.
This firmly anchors the candidate to their community.
It prevents a centralized party headquarters from simply parachuting 50 loyalists from the capital into rural districts where they have no connection to the people. You have to prove that at least 25 people who live in your specific town trust you.
So let's look at the math of how this actually pries the system open. Under the current closed-loop system, if an independent group of highly qualified experts, say a team of university economists who want to fix the inflation crisis wanted to run, they would need 10,000 notarized signatures just to form a list.
Which we established is nearly impossible.
Right. Under the professor's emergency patch, how does that math change?
It radically alters the landscape. Under the patch, if a small, focused group of just 8 brilliant specialists decides to run as a coalition, they don't need 10,000 signatures.
Because the burden is on the individual now.
Exactly. Because there are 8 candidates and each needs 50 signatures, they only require a total of 400 signatures.
400 signatures instead of 10,000. That completely destroys the systemic moat.
It does. It allows specialized, credible voices economists, legal scholars, environmental scientists, healthcare administrators to enter the political race easily.
They don't need millions of dollars.
They don't need a nationwide network of political operatives. They just need their professional credibility and 400 supporters who believe in their expertise.
It changes the entire dynamic of the election for you, the voter. Instead of looking at a ballot and seeing a generic party slogan hiding 250 anonymous loyalists,
You see real people.
you could look at a ballot and see a named list of 8 specific experts proposing concrete, actionable solutions to specific problems. It injects actual substance back into the democratic process.
It is a profound shift from brand voting to substance voting.
And what I found truly fascinating in the source material is what happens next during the lecture. Because the professor presents this 50 signature rule, and then during the discussion phase, an audience member actually improves the engineering of the patch in real time.
Yes, the live Q&A segment of this lecture is incredibly rich. A participant in the audience raises their hand and proposes a vital digital upgrade to the signature gathering process.
I thought this was brilliant.
They suggest that instead of relying on paper and physical notaries at all, the state should utilize its already existing e-government infrastructure. Specifically, they point to an application called Consent ID.
Now, for those who might not be familiar with this specific type of tech infrastructure, let's explain what that means. Many modern states, including the one discussed in the lecture, have spent millions developing secure digital identity applications for their citizens.
It is essentially a digital passport on your phone.
Exactly. These are apps that use biometric data or strict verification to prove you are who you say you are online. You use them to pay taxes, renew your driver's license, or access medical records securely.
It is state-verified digital identity. And the listener's suggestion is to simply allow citizens to use this existing consent ID application to digitally sign their support for a candidate's list.
It is an elegant technological addition.
Why is it so brilliant? Because it completely, utterly bypasses the financial bottleneck of paying public notaries.
If you can use your state-verified digital identity to securely sign a document supporting a candidate from your living room, the financial cost of entry drops to zero.
You don't need to rent a bus. You don't need to pay notary fees.
You just need to convince voters that your ideas are good and they can support you with 2 taps on their smartphone.
It democratizes the process instantly. And what makes it so pragmatic is that it utilizes infrastructure that the state has already built, tested, and paid for.
It requires no new massive government project.
It just requires opening an API to the Electoral Commission.
It's a perfect example of a civic hack. But as we know in engineering, every time you alter a system to solve one problem, you inevitably introduce a new vulnerability.
Always.
If you make it this incredibly easy and cheap to get on the ballot, just 50 digital signatures, doesn't it become equally easy for malicious actors to exploit the process?
That is the exact vulnerability the professor anticipates. Lowering the barrier to entry is essential for democracy. But if the door is left wide open with no screen, the house fills with mosquitoes.
Right.
The professor recognizes that the current system is already plagued by malicious actors, and making entry easier could amplify that problem if not checked.
This leads him to outline a severe structural defense against what he terms the phantom party trap.
To really understand this trap, we need to understand the grift it is designed to stop.
The source material details how the current electoral system is heavily exploited by fake satellite political parties.
These are entities that exist strictly on paper.
They have no offices, no members, and no actual platform. They often magically emerge from the woodwork just weeks before an election is called.
Their purpose is entirely cynical. They do not exist to govern. They do not exist to represent the interests of citizens.
What do they exist for then?
Their primary, often sole purpose, is to siphon off state campaign funds. In the system being discussed, the state legally allocates a significant amount of taxpayer money, specifically 0.07% of the state's total tax revenue, to fund the campaigns of registered electoral lists.
And we should clarify why a state does that in the first place.
Yeah.
Public funding for elections is generally designed as a good thing.
In theory, yes.
It is meant to level the playing field so that you don't have to be a billionaire oligarch to run for office. The state provides a budget so candidates can buy television time, print flyers, and travel to speak to voters. It is supposed to protect the democracy from being bought by corporate interests.
That is the intended philosophy, yes. But the reality, as the lecture notes, is that these phantom parties go through the motions of gathering the initial signatures, often through highly dubious means, sometimes by simply purchasing databases of signatures from corrupt insiders, simply to qualify for that initial injection of state funding.
And once the money hits their bank account,
The campaign disappears. The money is quietly pocketed or funneled back to the ruling party that secretly sponsored them.
the lecture highlights the absurdity of this. These phantom parties frequently end up winning a tiny fraction of the votes compared to the 10,000 signatures they supposedly gathered just to register.
They might submit 10,000 signatures and get 300 votes on Election Day.
It is a direct, brazen drain on public resources. It is stealing taxpayer money. And worse, it clutters the physical ballot.
It confuses the voter.
If you are a voter trying to find the genuine opposition party, you have to wade through 20 fake parties with confusingly similar names.
Which fragments the opposition vote and ultimately benefits the entrenched ruling party.
So, if the professor is lowering the barrier to entry to 50 signatures, he knows the phantom parties will try to flood the zone. How does he stop them?
He engineers a mechanism of intense financial accountability. He introduces the requirement of financial collateral.
Financial collateral to run for office?
Yes. To participate in the election under this emergency patch and to receive any of those state campaign funds, an electoralist must deposit promissory notes.
Let's explain what a promissory note is in this legal context. This isn't just an IOU written on a napkin.
No, it is a legally binding financial instrument. It is a written promise to pay a specific amount of money on demand.
By signing these notes and handing them to the Electoral Commission, the candidates are putting their own personal assets on the line as a guarantee against the taxpayer money they're about to receive.
Exactly. And the mechanic that triggers these promissory notes is enforced by a strict, unforgiving mathematical formula.
The 10-to-1 penalty ratio.
Yes. based on the signatures they submitted.
Mm.
If an electoral list fails to win at least 10 times the number of signatures they submitted in actual votes on Election Day, the trap snaps shut.
Mhm.
They face total financial ruin.
Let's trace that math for you so you can see how brutal and effective this is. Imagine you're that small list of genuine experts we talked about earlier. You have 10 candidates on your list.
Okay.
Under the 50-signature rule, you submit 500 signatures total to get on the ballot. You receive your state campaign funds. To avoid the penalty, you must win at least 5,000 votes.
Which is 10 times your 500 signatures.
Right. You must win 5,000 votes on Election Day.
If you hit 5,000 votes, the promissory notes are torn up. You proved you had a genuine mandate and legitimate public support.
But if you fail to hit that threshold,
The notes are immediately activated. And the professor is very clear about the consequences. The state does not simply send a polite letter asking for the campaign funds back.
it gets aggressive.
Very. The process involves aggressive debt collectors. The candidates' personal and business bank accounts are blocked. Their assets, their cars, their property are seized by bailiffs and sold at public auction. As the professor starkly puts it in the lecture, they go bankrupt.
I have to admit, when I first read that part of the source material, I had a visceral reaction. That is a brutal deterrent. You're talking about ruining someone's life over an election result.
It is severe.
But when you think about the psychology of deterrence, it is utterly fascinating. It ensures that absolutely no one plays frivolous games with the electoral system just to secure 15 minutes of television time or to steal a quick buck from the campaign fund.
Exactly. If you do not genuinely deeply believe in your heart that you have a mandate and real support from the public, running for office under this patch carries an existential financial risk.
It introduces severe friction into the grift. A corrupt political operative might feel entirely comfortable stealing millions of dinars from a faceless bureaucratic state fund if the only risk is a slap on the wrist or a minor fine paid by a shell company.
But when the risk is losing their own home, their own bank account, and facing personal bankruptcy,
The risk calculus changes entirely. The phantom party model becomes too dangerous to operate.
and there's another layer to this penalty that adds a massive moral weight to the deterrent. We might call it the Robin Hood clause.
I found this detail incredible because the professor does not just say the seized assets go back into the general government treasury, where they might just get stolen again by corrupt officials.
No, the professor dictates a very specific destination for these funds. The money seized from the bankruptcies of these fraudulent or frivolous political actors is explicitly redirected by law to a dedicated state fund for the medical treatment of sick children.
Let's just pause and think about the public relations nightmare that creates for a corrupt politician. It is an absolute masterstroke of psychological engineering.
It really is.
You aren't just messing with the tax authority or the electoral commission at that point. If you run a fake party and you fail, the bailiffs seize your Mercedes, sell it, and hand the check to a pediatric oncology ward.
The optics are impossible to survive.
The public optics of effectively attempting to steal from a children's medical fund and facing personal bankruptcy and public humiliation in the process makes the scheme completely toxic. No corrupt operative wants that PR nightmare.
It is a system designed to ruthlessly enforce seriousness and integrity. It uses the greed of the malicious actors against them.
So that handles getting on the ballot.
Yes. Up to this point, the lecture has focused on the architecture of getting on the ballot and campaigning. But the professor then moves from the financial architecture back to the mechanical, day-to-day functioning of the parliament and the polling stations themselves.
He introduces two final mechanical fixes to complete this emergency patch.
The first of these addresses the deeply cynical problem of political turncoats.
The source material refers to this specific practice as mandate trading. And if you follow politics anywhere in the world, you have likely seen some version of this.
It's a universal problem.
This is the scenario where a politician campaigns fiercely on one specific platform, representing a certain opposition party or reform coalition. Voters trust them, they cast their ballots, and this politician is elected.
But almost the minute they are safely inside the assembly building,
They suddenly switch sides, often defecting to join the ruling majority party.
the lecture strongly implies, and historical precedent in the region supports this, that this defection is very rarely due to a sudden, genuine ideological unskinning.
A politician doesn't usually wake up on a Tuesday and realize their entire worldview was wrong.
No, this switching of sides is almost always driven by cold, hard bribery. It might be direct financial compensation, the promise of lucrative appointments to powerful state-owned enterprise boards, or the assignment to a prestigious parliamentary committee.
Whatever the bribe is, the result is a complete betrayal of the voters. The citizens who voted for an opposition watchdog wake up to find they have accidentally elected another rubber stamp for the ruling party.
But as the professor notes, there is a very tricky legal tension here when trying to solve this. In many modern constitutional frameworks, including the one discussed in the lecture, the electoral mandate legally belongs to the individual representative, not to the political party.
And that is a crucial democratic safeguard. You want the mandate to belong to the individual so that a powerful party boss cannot simply fire an elected official who refuses to vote the party line on a matter of conscience.
If the mandate belonged to the party, the parliament would just be a handful of party leaders dictating votes to robots. You need independent representatives.
Okay, so here's the puzzle for you. How do you prevent a corrupt politician from selling their vote to the highest bidder without stripping the individual of their constitutional right to hold their elected seat?
If you can't fire them, how do you stop them?
Exactly.
The professor proposes a mechanical solution that he calls the frozen button. It is an elegant piece of legislative engineering. Under this proposed rule, if a member of parliament decides to leave the original electoral group or party platform under which they were elected by the voters, their mandate is immediately frozen.
What does frozen mean in this context? Because they aren't expelled from the parliament building, right?
No, they're not expelled. They retain their physical seat in the National Assembly. They keep their salary.
They can still go to work.
They can participate in committee debates. They can walk up to the podium, and they can argue their new points on the public record as much as they want. Their voice is not silenced. However, the physical voting button on their desk is deactivated.
Their vote simply no longer counts in the total parliamentary tally. They become a spectator.
Exactly. They are reduced to a speaking role with zero legislative power. And if we look at the mechanics of why this works, it is brilliant because it attacks the root cause, the financial incentive.
It instantly destroys the market for mandate trading.
Let's look at this from the perspective of the corrupt ruling party. Why would a ruling party boss offer hundreds of thousands of dinars or a lucrative board seat to an opposition member to switch sides if that member immediately loses their ability to cast a vote?
They gain absolutely no numerical advantage in passing their legislation.
The ruling party is buying a vote that disappears the moment the transaction clears.
The value of the turncoat drops to zero. The market is eliminated overnight. Not through complex anti-corruption investigations that take years and often fail, but through a simple, immediate adjustment of the parliamentary rules of procedure.
You keep your seat, but if you betray your voters, you lose your power.
That is a phenomenal fix, but it only works once the politicians are inside the building. The second mechanical fix the professor proposes moves us out of the assembly hall and back down to the grassroots level.
For the polling stations on Election Day.
Right. The source material addresses widespread, deep-seated public fears regarding outright voter fraud at the ballot box. We're talking about ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, and manipulated vote counts by corrupt election officials.
The professor's solution here is remarkably pragmatic because it does not require inventing new technology or waiting years for development. It relies entirely on cheap, off-the-shelf consumer technology.
He proposes the mandatory deployment of 4G wireless cameras in every single polling station across the entire country.
Now, the immediate reaction anyone has when they hear cameras in polling stations is a concern for privacy. The secret ballot is the cornerstone of democracy.
If the state is filming me voting, that is terrifying.
And the professor is extremely careful to address this. The placement of these cameras is critical. They are positioned high up to cover the ballot boxes themselves and the general flow of traffic in the room.
They allow for continuous visual monitoring of the administrative process.
Crucially, the professor emphasizes that these cameras must absolutely respect the privacy screen. The actual physical act of a citizen taking a pen and marking their paper ballot behind the cardboard screen remains entirely secret and unrecorded.
So the camera isn't watching who you vote for, it is watching that you voted and that you are a real human being putting one piece of paper into the box.
Precisely. And the key to this system is not just that the cameras are recording, but where that recording goes. The feed from these 4G cameras would not be sent to some secure, closed-door government server where officials could tamper with it.
The mandate requires that every camera stream its feed live, continuously, directly to massive public platforms like YouTube.
This effectively deputizes the entire population of the country as election monitors. The lecture points out the sheer decentralized power of this. Think about what this means for you.
You don't have to trust an official election observer who might be compromised.
Any citizen sitting at home on their couch with a laptop can log on to the YouTube stream for their specific local elementary school or community center where they vote.
They can sit there with a notepad and physically count the exact number of human beings who walk through the door, receive a ballot, and drop a paper into the box over the course of the 14-hour voting day.
It creates an indisputable crowdsourced reality. At the end of the night, if a citizen and their neighbors count exactly 567 people entering the station on the video feed, but the official state tally released the next morning claims 1,000 people voted at that location.
The discrepancy is immediate, it is visual, and it is undeniably public. The state cannot claim it was a clerical error.
Furthermore, the emergency patch requires that this digital archive remains publicly accessible online for a full year after the election. It leaves an immutable digital trail.
If a corrupt local official wants to wait until the polling station closes, unlock the box, and stuff 300 fake ballots inside, they have to do it on a live YouTube feed.
It makes large-scale, coordinated ballot stuffing nearly impossible to execute without leaving massive, easily shareable visual evidence of a crime.
These are all highly pragmatic, beautifully engineered solutions. The 50 signatures to lower the barrier, the promissory notes to punish grifters, the frozen button to stop bribery, and the 4G cameras to crowdsource election integrity.
They fit together to form a logical, cohesive patch. If implemented, they would mathematically stabilize the system.
But as the lecture transitions into the live Q&A segment with the audience, we see a stark shift in tone. We watch these clean, theoretical mechanics collide head-on with the raw, messy, and deeply emotional reality of citizen frustration.
This transition into the discussion phase is where the source material gets incredibly heavy. It reveals a profound tension in the room. This is where we see the absolute limits of engineering when it is applied to a fractured, traumatized society.
The debate among the audience members immediately splits into two distinct, passionate camps, which we can categorize as the argument for the streets versus the argument for institutions.
It is a classic, painful, democratic dilemma. We hear from a very passionate audience member who articulates the argument for the streets, and their perspective is not based on a misunderstanding of the math. It is deeply rooted in moral outrage and historical exhaustion.
They argue vehemently against participating in any election run by the current ruling party, regardless of whatever brilliant emergency patches the professor applies to the ballot.
For this participant, and the large segment of the population they represent, the system is so fundamentally compromised, the ruling party is so deeply corrupt, that the mere act of participation acts as a validation of that corruption.
They view the ruling party as entirely illegitimate. Their argument is essentially, if you sit down at a poker table where you know the dealer has a stacked deck, asking for a different colored deck of cards doesn't make the game fair.
Playing by their rules, even modified rules, is a trap.
Their proposed solution is a complete, uncompromising withdrawal of consent. They advocate for pure civil disobedience and sustained national general strikes. They demand that the public refuse to play a rigged game entirely.
Their hope is that massive paralyzing pressure from outside the institutions, blocking roads, shutting down schools, halting the economy, will force a systemic collapse and allow the country to start over with a truly clean slate.
It is a powerful argument because it is based on the pursuit of a moral absolute. You do not negotiate with a system you believe is inherently unjust. You do not weld a patch onto a rotten pillar. You tear the building down.
But the professor and several other engineers and pragmatic thinkers in the audience push back with a starkly different perspective: the argument for institutions.
Their counter-argument is anchored not in moral purity, but in pragmatic, often grim, survival. They readily acknowledge the moral validity of the frustration. They agree the system is corrupt.
But they point out the brutal, logistical reality of sustaining a general strike in a modern economy.
As one participant notes in the discussion, calling for a general strike from a university lecture hall is easy. Maintaining it on the streets is incredibly difficult.
Regular citizens, the people you need to actually shut the country down, have families to feed. They have mortgages and rent to pay. They have jobs to keep in an already fragile economy.
General strike requires millions of individuals to voluntarily sacrifice their livelihoods and their stability indefinitely.
The pragmatic camp warns that relying solely on street pressure without an institutional off-ramp like the emergency patch is a massive, dangerous gamble.
If the opposition takes to the streets and the ruling party simply locks the doors of the government building and waits them out, what happens?
The public eventually exhausts its energy. People run out of savings, they have to go back to work, and if the protests fade without achieving a tangible institutional change, the crisis doesn't end.
It just drags on, unresolved, for years.
And the consequences of a protracted, unresolved crisis are devastating. The source material outlines this bleak trajectory, and it is heartbreaking.
If the society remains paralyzed in the standoff, universities cease to function properly, leading to lost years of education for an entire generation of students.
The economy stagnates because no one invests in a paralyzed country. And ultimately, the most tragic consequence, mass immigration.
Citizens simply give up. They look at the endless protests and the entrenched corruption, and they pack their bags and leave the country to find stability elsewhere. It is the slow, quiet destruction of the society from within.
The brain drain becomes fatal.
The deep dive here requires us to really sit with and reflect on this heavy burden. The mathematical and engineering solutions proposed by Professor Enck, the frozen buttons, the digital consent ID signatures, the promissory notes, they are brilliant.
They can theoretically fix a broken ballot. They can balance the equations of an election and prevent technical fraud.
But they cannot easily repair the deep, burning distrust within a society that has fundamentally lost faith in its own frameworks. The tension in that lecture hall, as captured in the source material, is palpable.
And it is a tension without an easy, satisfying resolution. We are witnessing the clash between the desperate desire for pure, uncompromising justice and the grim, heavy necessity of functional, day-to-day survival.
It perfectly illustrates the ultimate limit of the technocratic approach to politics. You can design the most optimal, mathematically perfect system in the world.
But a system is just a set of rules. It must be inhabited by human beings who actually believe in it and who trust each other enough to abide by those rules.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up this analysis. Imagine that team of brilliant engineers succeeds. They design an electoral system that is mechanically perfect, statistically fair, and technically immune to fraud.
But the population has been burned so many times that they have fundamentally lost faith in the institution's willingness to actually enact and respect those rules.
If that happens, where does the power actually reside? Does the power of a democracy live in the perfection of the legal code and the 4G cameras, or does it live entirely in the willingness of the people to believe in it and enforce it?
It is the ultimate, enduring caution of governance. A patch can fix the machine, but it cannot fix the soul of the electorate.
We want to thank you for joining us on this very thorough, very grounded deep dive into the mechanics of democratic triage. It is a heavy topic, but an essential one for understanding how systems survive under pressure. Until next time.